Welcome to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. On Fridays, I will be posting clips from previous episodes, and the point here is just to bring you some of the highest yield topics from each podcast in order to kind of reinforce those topics. This clip is from the Renal Physiology podcast and covers the 3 key regulatory hormones to know for the renal system. That is vasopressin, aldosterone, and last but not least, atrial natriuretic peptide hormone. Enjoy. All right, so there are 3 key hormones that affect the kidneys and more specifically affect the nephron. The first is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and this is sometimes also called vasopressin. The second hormone is called aldosterone, and the third hormone is called natriuretic peptide hormone, which to me is the most interesting of the 3 and also the hardest to say. That literally just took me like 15 different takes to actually say natriuretic right. So it is an atrial natriuretic peptide hormone. All right, so let's get into the first of these hormones, which is antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin. So antidiuretic hormone is synthesized in the hypothalamus, and it is a peptide hormone. And it's very important for the maintenance of blood tonicity, or blood osmolarity. And what it does is it controls the concentration of solutes in the blood. And so ADH is stored in neurons within the hypothalamus, and these neurons actually have what are called osmoreceptors. And if you think back to physiology, these are just receptors that respond to changes in blood osmolarity. And they're very, very, very sensitive. For example, they can detect as little as a change in 2 milliosmoles per liter. So that's a teeny change in concentration. So you imagine changing from 18 milliosmoles per liter to 20. Well, these really sensitive neurons with these osmoreceptors can sense that. And just an interesting aside, these same osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are responsible for your feeling of thirst. And so these slight increases in osmolarity that are detected by these neurons in the hypothalamus result in the secretion of antidiuretic hormone. And antidiuretic hormone acts primarily on the collecting duct by increasing the number of aquaporin 2 proteins that are in the cell membrane of cells that make up the collecting duct. So what does that do? That just allows more water to be reabsorbed. So when you secrete this ADH, you get more aquaporins, which means more water can be reabsorbed. And so how exactly does this mechanism act? Well, what happens is, if you think back to what I said before, ADH is a peptide hormone. So what do peptide hormones do? Well, if you haven't listened to my podcast on that, then you might not know. And what they do is they bind extracellularly. So they're going to bind to a receptor on the outside of a cell. In this case, ADH binds to a receptor called the V receptor on cells in the collecting duct. And that is going to trigger a G protein coupled receptor pathway that goes on then to trigger the movement of aquaporin 2 proteins to the membrane of these collecting duct cells. So what causes ADH to be released? Well, anytime you need to increase the plasma fluid volume or decrease the osmolarity, ADH will be stimulated. So if you're reabsorbing just water, that's either going to dilute your blood, which is decreasing the osmolarity, or it's going to increase your plasma fluid volume, or both. So anything that drastically reduces your plasma volume will immediately induce ADH to be released. So imagine you're vomiting, maybe you've had a long night, you're vomiting the next morning, whatever. Your hypothalamus is going to start releasing a lot of this ADH because you're trying to increase your fluid volume. Or maybe you are in Game of Thrones and you get your hand chopped off, shout out Jamie, and now you're losing a lot of blood and therefore you're losing a lot of plasma fluid volume. So your hypothalamus is going to be, again, releasing a lot of this antidiuretic hormone. In addition, it will be stimulated whenever you increase the osmolarity of your blood. You might have eaten a lot of salts, eaten a lot of glucose, whatever it is. This will stimulate your hypothalamus to produce ADH. So what's the takeaway here? Well, ADH, or vasopressin, increases the reabsorption of water in the collecting ducts by increasing the number of aquaporins that are in the cell membrane. The next hormone I want to talk about is aldosterone. And aldosterone is produced in the adrenal cortex, and it is a steroid hormone, i.e. it is made of this 4-ring structure that's derived from cholesterol. And it plays a big role in sodium and potassium regulation, as well as blood pressure regulation. And it does this by stimulating the reabsorption of water and sodium and increasing the secretion of potassium. So that's to say that it helps you retain water and salt, sodium salt, and it helps you get rid of excess potassium. And to understand aldosterone's mechanism of action, you need to understand what steroid hormones do to act or how they act. And again, you can go back to my hormones podcast, but essentially how they act is they are able to diffuse through the cell membrane and they bind to these nuclear receptors where they then affect transcription. So it's a much slower process than, say, like a peptide hormone, but just know that they go all the way inside the cell and they affect transcription. Still, the most important thing to know, obviously, in terms of renal physiology is where aldosterone acts. So aldosterone acts primarily on cells in the collecting duct and in the distal convoluted tubule. And so essentially what aldosterone does is it will go to these cells in either the distal convoluted tubule or the collecting duct, diffuse through and bind to nuclear receptors. And what that then does is it stimulates the production of these different membrane transporters. So it starts increasing the transcription of the mRNA that then gets transcribed to make these proteins that then act as different channels or different transporters for sodium ions and potassium ions, and also water. All right, so that is aldosterone. Let me quickly recap that. So the takeaway here is that aldosterone acts on the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule by increasing the reabsorption of sodium and increasing the secretion of potassium. And so the secretion of more aldosterone will increase blood osmolarity, leading to a higher blood volume, whereas less aldosterone will result in a lower blood osmolarity, also a lower blood volume, and if you were to take a little swig of your urine, it would be more salty. The next hormone is called Atrial Natriuretic Peptide Hormone, or ANP. And this is, as I said before, this is a sweet system, super cool. So this hormone is a peptide hormone, and it is actually secreted from cells in the cardiac atria, which is the heart. And this hormone is released in response to overstretching of the heart. And so essentially what happens is when your blood volume is too large, your heart can kind of tell it is being overstretched. It's like, damn, you got a lot of blood here. What the hell's going on? And it responds to that increase in blood volume or that extra stretch in the heart by releasing this atrial natriuretic peptide hormone, or ANP. And so at this point, I hope that you're thinking, okay, well, this hormone is released when the blood volume is too large, then it must act to decrease blood volume. And if you're thinking that, you're right, because that's what it does. And so how does it do this? Well, mechanistically, it is a peptide hormone. So it binds to the exterior of cells. And in this case, it binds to some non-G protein coupled receptor protein. And in this case, like others, this binding triggers an intracellular signaling pathway that eventually affects something within the cell. And you don't really need to know what exactly it affects within the cell. I'd know just kind of the big global things that it does to the nephron and to the kidneys. So it does a bunch of different shit. And so it increases glomerular filtration rate, which is the rate at which fluid is filtered through the glomerulus. And so obviously there you're getting rid of excess fluid. And it also acts to decrease sodium and chloride concentration in the distal convoluted tubule. And so remember, what happens when sodium and chloride are reabsorbed is sometimes water will follow that to try to even out the osmolarity between the nephron and the blood. And so here, that's just another mechanism that helps you excrete essentially more water. And so remember that typically water will kind of follow these ions as it tries to even out the osmolarity between the nephron and the blood. You know, it's a little bit like that one annoying friend who just kind of follows you around a party. You know, you're trying to go talk to different people, be social, and you just got this person that keeps sticking around by you. That's water, essentially, in this case. So again, you decrease the amount of sodium and chloride that are reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule. The third thing that this AMP does is it decreases renin production. And renin is just a hormone that is produced in the kidneys that stimulates you to drink more water. And so essentially what's going on there is it is decreasing the signal for you to drink water. And therefore you drink less water and your blood volume doesn't increase because you're drinking more water. The takeaway here is that atrial natriuretic peptide hormone acts in opposition to aldosterone. It decreases plasma volume through a bunch of different mechanisms.
If you want to be featured in an upcoming podcast, go to the show notes of this podcast and follow the link I have to record your voice. Basically, you'll go to a web page at perspectivedoctor.com. You'll click on a link, and then you can record your voice. And I'm looking for questions that people have about the MCAT, maybe particular material that I haven't covered so far. And I want to hear just how MCAT studying is going for you guys. So just leave me a voice message. And actually, I'm going to feature some of you on upcoming episodes. So if you're interested in doing that, again, just follow the link. You can do it from your phone, from a computer. It's really pretty simple. You just click the button, you talk, and then you send your message.
Med School Coach, we know that getting into medical school is hard. In fact, 60% of pre-meds who apply to medical school don't even get accepted. And if you want to get accepted into a top medical school, it's even harder. It's a complicated process, and even students with great grades and MCAT scores get left out. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for admissions advising. Our advisors are all physicians and former admissions committee members, so they know exactly what medical schools are looking for. One-on-one admissions advising from Med School Coach makes all the difference. Our expert team will help you develop a game plan, prepare your application, edit your essays, and coach you for interviews. Every pre-med has a story, and we'll help you tell it so you can stand out from the crowd. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach admissions advising package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.